name's John Lundwall. I have a doctorate in comparative myth and religious studies out of California. I'm the project leader of the archaeoastronomy project of Fremont Indian State Park. I lead tours, doing one to Chaco Canyon in June through the megalithic sites of England next year. I'm going to Egypt in May, and anyway, that's me. I don't know if that's on.
This one, yeah. Okay. Well, my name's Beth Buck. I'm the acquisition director for Immortal Works Press, and I write some short stories on the side. My most recent one was published at the LTUE anthology benefit, and so I would invite you to all purchase a copy and support the con. I have a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies and in Arabic, and in 2004 I spent 3 months in Egypt.
I'm Nikhil Rao. I actually have no specific Egypt expertise whatsoever, but I am a Jungian in the sense that I think that even in the modern day, and perhaps more so in the modern day, mythology actually has a lot to tell us about how we operate. The idea of archetypes, the idea of the world being captured in stuff. But I'll mostly give the floor to these two since they're the experts.
I'm not an expert, and I have no idea how I operate.
And my name is Peter Orullian. I write epic fantasy for Tor. I've done a lot of work recently novelizing concept albums from bands like Dream Theater. I'm very fond of the intersection of music and fiction. And the current thing I'm working on is an urban fantasy series where I'm collaborating with Brandon Sanderson. So that's where most of my writing time goes right now. So let's begin. Start to formulate your questions as we go from things that are said. And we'll kind of dive into this topic. The topic was super broad as the abstract was written in the program for the con. So I'm glad for this to take shape as we go, based upon commentary from the panelists. But I did a little bit of sort of crash course because this is not my expertise. And it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's sort of two large ideas, as is the case with a lot of sort of religious or mythic traditions of, and I may mispronounce these, but Mot and Isfet. Am I pronouncing those correctly?
Sounds okay.
Okay.
I say go for it. Yeah. You're right.
Okay.
Mot.
What I'd love to do is establish these sort of unifying and yet disparate ideas in Egyptian mythology for the people who are here, because it seems like that's the umbrella under which most of the stories exist. All right. Is there enough familiarity with those two as a launching place?
Mot is cosmic order. And there is actually it's a universal idea in mythological cultures. It's similar to Tao, similar to Dharma, in that there is an overriding cosmic order that the society has to repeat. In the ancient world, truth was cosmic fact, not historical fact. For us, truth is historical fact. Mythologies are archetypal stories that repeat a cosmic fact. And so we often say that they're not truth because they're not historical, but it turns out that's exactly what they are. They are truth, and they're not historical, they're cosmic. So to ancient oral societies, they are reiterating the cosmic facts. It turns out this idea extends all the way until the turn of the millennium. You know, when Plato writes his Great Republic, he's going to tell you what the great civilization would look like. And he starts out, and he starts muddling around, and eventually he just quits and goes into cosmology, because the proper run city-state was a model of the proper run cosmos. So Egyptian mythology, along with a lot of ancient mythologies, are really getting at these cosmic truths and how to live by them, because if you can repeat that in your city, state, then you're living the correct way. Never mind human sacrifice, but there's a correct way to do it. So be assured.
One of the So let me ask a question dovetailing off that. And this came out of the sort of brief interchange we had via Facebook Messenger. And there was the desire to kind of talk about the difference between ancient and modern or medieval Egypt. One of the things that I gleaned in looking at this is that the ancient was about what you described, but that later it really became about describing the cyclical patterns and less about the sort of truth from chaos that they defined early on that didn't have any sort of predicate. Is that a fair way to characterize the difference?
I think I think the thing to mostly use to differentiate Pharaonic Egypt or ancient Egypt and medieval Egypt being described as like 1100 and onwards is they're completely different cultures. As an acquisitions editor, I get a lot of people who don't really understand the distinction. The thing you have to understand is Pharaonic Egypt pretty much died when Alexander the Great conquered it. And from then, that's when you stop having Egyptian pharaohs and you start having Greek rulers. And then later when Caesar conquered Alexandria, then you have the Romans in there. And after the Roman conquest of Alexandria, the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphics was completely lost. And that's when you have the flowering of Coptic Christianity in that area. And then, of course, Islam came in. I think that was about the 800s or so. And so medieval Egypt that's when you have like the Abbasid dynasty and the Umayyad dynasty, and which probably not many people in this room are familiar with. But they're speaking completely different languages. There's a lot of difference in ethnic group or in who is governing Egypt. The names of the governors and the citizens are going to be different because they came from this different culture.
So that's you know more about it. So as far as what you said is truth as far as I'm concerned. But one of the things you said that I read, and I'm just going to quote this verbatim, it said that Mott was formed to meet the complex needs of the emergent Egyptian state that combined diverse peoples with conflicting interests. But if Mott existed or became a thing in Pharaonic Egypt, is it fair to say that even back then it was this sort of melting pot of?
I would say so. If you look at a map, if we had a whiteboard, I'd draw you one. If you look at a map of the Middle East and the Mediterranean area, you see that Egypt is right there at the joining of almost 3 different continents. Because you have Europe, and you have Africa, and you have Asia. And so you have lots of different peoples moving in all the time. During the Pharaonic period, there was a group called the Hyksos, also called the Sea Peoples. They came in from about the Levant, but there's not really a lot of records about them, and it's kind of weird. And then you see a lot of conflict but there's a lot of written records conflicting between the Nubians in the south and the Egyptians in the north. And so because you have a lot of this conflict, you have a lot of people who come and stay. And then you have more people come and stay. So if you want to know the technical term for it, it's called a shatter belt. And the Middle East is still today considered a shatter belt. And that existed even in Pharaonic times. And we see it a lot also in the art of the spanning the several thousand years that ancient Egypt existed, where sometimes you see people of different skin colors ruling. So.
All right, so now let's start to kind of move it towards a path that might create some value for writers as a way to use this information interestingly in stories. And the way I have a couple of questions that I think might get us there. One is, as I was sort of just doing some little bit of reading on this, there was a description of the difference between Egyptian mythology and Egyptian religion. Can you help us understand what that is? Because the panel's about mythology, which, if I were going to take a stab at that, it's the stories about what the gods are doing. So what is the difference? Like, what's the synopsis, the 11-second pitch on the difference between Egyptian mythology and Egyptian religion? Or are they not separable?
Well, if you ask that question in a room of 100 scholars, after 5 minutes, only one scholar would be alive. And the other 99 would have been eaten in a cannibalistic act of sacrifice. Look, our understanding of Egyptian mythology comes very late. We get some very Plutarch and Manetho and Herodotus. Herodotus is probably the earliest writer who's writing about, Egypt starts 3000 BCE. We know nothing of the origins. Suddenly there's a pyramid in the sand and it's covered in pyramid texts. Well, where did they get the ideas of those pyramid texts? That all was created in prehistory, right? Egypt didn't invent Egyptian religion, they inherited it. And we know nothing about that. So the stories of Egyptian myth come to us very late and they descend from Egyptian religion. So I am one of those scholars that would argue there is no difference between myth and religion in Egypt. The myths are, look, you go into the temples and there's all these carvings on the temple walls, on the tomb walls, pyramid walls, and there's no, story being told in some grand narrative arc on these walls. What you get is a bunch of narrative scenarios attached to rituals. All those panels are actually being ritualized, and so the priest or priestesses know the story, but that's a priori knowledge. What we get is really just footnotes of the story as we get this ritualized text on the walls. And so the truth of the matter is our knowledge of Egyptian mythology is very limited, probably incredibly fractured. It's been disassociated with the cosmology and rituals in which it originated, and it comes to us very late.
If I may elaborate.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah. So to elaborate on what Dr. Lundwall is saying, when he's saying that Egyptian mythology comes to us very late, I said earlier that after the Roman conquest, knowledge of hieroglyphics was lost. And I'm very serious when I mean that. You see, in later periods, the Islamic caliphs of Egypt actually didn't know what the pyramids were for, and one of them tried to unbuild one. And he got about 5 years in, and we realized that it was pointless. And then also in the medieval period, the great temples of Luxor and Karnak were completely covered with sand. People didn't know that they were temples. And in fact, the word Luxor comes from the Arabic word al-Aqsar, meaning castles. They thought they were castles down there. And even today, that they have excavated it, you see that they've built a mosque, they built a mosque in the Temple of Luxor, but it's about 20 feet up from ground level when you go visit it. So we have this whole big period of knowledge where we had no idea what all of this ancient Egypt stuff was. And nobody knew until Jean-Francois Champollion finally figured out how to translate the Rosetta Stone, and that was in the 1820s. So we have only 200 years of knowledge of ancient Egypt. And compared that to how long we've been studying and learning and dissecting and digesting Greek mythology, which we've had almost continuously. Wouldn't you agree? So.
Well, I would just add that despite our translation, our Egyptologists' ability to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, they still don't have any idea what they mean. Translation implies understanding. We can go in and read the pyramid text, and then you say, what's it mean? Oh, it's a bunch of religious bugaboo. Right? I mean, which means we don't know. And to this day, no one really knows what the Great Pyramid was for. The official academic interpretation of the Great Pyramid is it's a tomb for the king. And, there's this great book, I'm trying to remember the Palmer is the author, 1920, and he wrote the most interesting theory of the Great Pyramid I have read, and no one seems to ever recite it, and that was, he believed it was a place where they performed chapters of the Book of the Dead in ritual dramas, and that the chambers and hallways corresponded to the chambers and hallways in the Book of the Dead. And I thought, well, that is probably closer, even if it were used as a tomb, that is probably closer to what it was originally intended for. But the bottom line is, again, we know this is why Egypt is so fertile to use in your stories, because we know so little. You can do anything with it. Aliens, time portals, time gates, stargates. It doesn't matter. It works. Somehow it works because it's been Egyptianized.
I'm going to go back to actually the first half of your statement there, and asking about how ancient Egypt, and I'm going to go ancient here, could be helpful to someone who's writing a fantasy or even science fiction novel. The shadow belt phenomenon that you talked about, that goes back to before Homo sapiens. When we talk about the richness of the evolution of humanity before Homo sapiens, back when it was Homo neanderthalensis or even Homo ergaster, which were basically really tall chimps. We're talking ancient here, that this place has always been a place of turmoil and of upheaval and of peoples fighting for dominance. But to go even further, we know that, or at least my layman's conception here of ancient Egypt is of this very long, skinny, narrow civilization. And I mean that in the very geographic sense of the fertility of the land was directly due to the Nile, and the Nile exceeding its banks once a year. So you have this civilization that's much more dependent on cyclicity and seasons than other parts of the world are. And that's important because Earth is a very mild planet. Whether we're talking a fantastic setting or a science fiction setting, we are a very regular planet with very regular temperatures. And I know people in Utah are like, what, it got 110 this summer? Now it's, you know, but very regular in the cosmic sense here. Ancient Egypt was not. Ancient Egypt was, they were edge people living on a frontier in which you step too far away from those banks of the Nile and you lose your lifeblood. Just like a habitat, terraformed habitat, or just like a fantastic setting in a world with more typical extremes for potentially life-harboring planets. Because again, we are the exception. We are the Goldilocks planet. And ancient Egypt gives us a view of what a non-Goldilocks planet, but still life-sustaining planet might look like.
Okay, so now let's move into some of the actual myths and talk about them a little bit. So I'm not super conversant here, but I'd like for us to pick some of those that are staples and some that may be less familiar, and just talk about them a little bit. So let's start at this end down here, because I'm assuming that many of you, while you're interested, may not be sort of very conversant with this. And so hearing about some of these might begin to spark ideas for you for narrative.
Well, you know, the Egyptians, by the Roman period, had thousands of deities. So, you know, there are the main deities that most people are familiar with, Osiris and Isis, and Horus, and Nephthys, and I suppose we could talk about them. Again, our data comes very late, where their stories are being told in narrative arcs. So, you know, the story of Osiris is he's the ruler, but he is killed by his brother Set. He's nailed into a coffin, and his wife Isis resurrects him. His body's chopped up and thrown in the river, and she finds the phallus and resurrects him from the phallus. And Horus is there to combat Set, and thus Osiris is a god of rebirth, of resurrection, and Isis is the female goddess of the womb who oversees that process. So that's sort of the basic story of Osiris. But, you know, as soon as you get back past the basic story, it gets complicated really quick, because you have different savior gods in different cities, right? So Ptah is the creator god in Memphis, and he holds some of those roles that Osiris has. And of course, the earlier forms of Osiris are different than the later forms of Osiris, which are different than the Roman forms of Osiris. You know you're in trouble that when you find Egyptian books of the dead that are being copied backwards, forwards, disassociated with the pictures they once were, that tells you that the Egyptian scribes in the ancient world had lost track of what it meant. They were just copying stuff to sell, right? So, again, we just have this massive 3,000-year history, and there is no consistent, uniform story or mythology that's going to run through it. But there is a grand theme of rebirth, and Osiris and Isis stand at the center of that narrative arc. And so wherever you find tombs where rebirth is being celebrated, Isis and Osiris are not, and Horus are not far off.
Well, I'd like to just emphasize, kind of coming off from that, to contrast with Greek and Roman mythology, we have this very set canon almost. Like you have a sun god, you have a all-father god, and you have a couple of mother goddesses, and that's it. That's like the pantheon. Ancient Egyptian mythology is not like that, because it spans several thousand years, and it spans a very large geographic area. And so you will find, like you said, in different cities and in different time periods, different interpretations of, there's like 4 creation myths in the book I have open in front of me, and that's probably just a small fraction of the ones that exist. And then, of course, there's Akhenaten, who is the, we have some giggling, it's the quote, heretic pharaoh who threw all of that out the window and briefly had a period of monotheism before everybody threw that out the window once he died and went back to polytheism. And so there's not a set, this is how things are. You will find in your research that everything is different, everything's mixed up, and you just, as writers, that's an advantage to you, because you can just pick what you want to pick, and it doesn't have to be right, because there is no right one.
That's just from a writing perspective, that's kind of a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, there's a lot of latitude, and you're not probably going to have, there's no capital T truth on what's correct, so you're not going to get a lot of hate mail saying you've got it absolutely wrong, because it's not defensible. On the other hand, if you decide to go down a path with one, and like I looked up and I got to some enormously long lists of here's all these super specialized gods with super specialized responsibilities, which is really interesting. But then the freight you carry as a writer is having to sort of disgorge that in order to lend some context to the narrative. So you don't get to do shorthand with these seminal stories like you'd have with Osiris. So you can pick your poison. Like the one is super familiar, and so maybe retread quite a bit. Or you can elect to go and find one of these lesser knowns and dig in. But then you end up having to do some deeper context, I think, to give it that sense of credibility or authenticity. So that's just a writer thing. There's not a wrong answer, but they each carry their own burden.
To go back a little bit to your original question, what are some of the myths? I think everybody's learned in high school about Osiris and Isis and Ra and all those. They're because we have some of the Greek stories, because most of our understanding of the narrative comes from the Greek folks there. There's one, Isis and the 7 Scorpions. And that's basically Isis helps somebody overcome a scorpion bite in a sound bite. I would describe that. There's also let's see, There's one where Isis tricks Ra into revealing his true name, and in this way Isis gains additional power. And Ra knows that she's going to share it with her son Horus, and so all he asks is that she doesn't tell anybody else besides Horus.
Can you tell us, I read a little bit, it was really interesting to me, about the weighing of the heart.
The wing of the heart?
Weighing of the heart.
Oh, the weighing of the heart. Well, the wing of the heart, oh, that's today, that's Valentine's Day. So, yeah, Ba is the heart, the soul. And so one of the most common scenes in Egyptian funerary texts is the judgment scene. And of course, there are dozens of Egyptian books of the dead, which is what modern archaeologists call them. The Egyptians called them the books of life. So, you know, that's just the way it goes. And so, really, the Egyptian funerary texts were to teach you how to live well, so that you could live well in the next life. It was all about rebirth and resurrection. And that's a beautiful idea. So the weighing of the heart scene is the soul enters the judgment bar, and the first thing it has to do is pass 72 judges. And each judge is actually represented by 72 nomes or cities within Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt. And these are called the negative confessions, where each judge, you walk up to each judge and you have to be able to say, I did not lie, right? If you actually did not lie, this judge of lying, say, okay, you did not lie, you can pass the next one. And the next judge is, I did not murder. And the next one, I did not eat that Tootsie Roll that my brother stole from. I didn't steal it either. And so you pass these 72 judges. In one Book of the Dead, I really like it because I don't think I could pass 72 negative confessions. I would be like, well, I did lie that one time. Well, actually, several times. But in one manuscript that I looked at, it was really good. The last judge did not ask a question. You did not confess anything to. It just held up a mirror. And the idea there is that if you can pass the 71 judges and you get to the last judge and you can look at yourself as you are and pass, then you're a whole person. And that's a beautiful idea. Anyway, you go through all of that, and then there's the weighing of the heart scene, where you go and your heart is put in a vase and it's put on these scales next to a feather, the feather of Mot, right? This cosmic deity of justice and balance. And if your heart, of course, a feather is light, right? If your heart's too heavy, the scales will go out of. If your heart is too light, then wow. And so if your heart does not balance with Mot, with cosmic truth, justice, and balance, then your heart gets consumed by an amphibian creature waiting to consume you. Looks suspiciously like my mother-in-law. Anyway. But that brings up a really interesting question, because several scholars have said, why do you have to have your heart weighed after passing 72 judges? If you can pass 72 judges, aren't you good? Right? What is the whole heart weighing scene? And yet the heart weighing scene goes back to the earliest parts. That is part of the entire cycle of rebirth. So it was part of the structure. And so no one really knows, but there's a few theories. And one of the theories is the 72 judges are your moral judgment, your ethical judgment, and the heart weighing is your ritual judgment. Have you been ritually purified in order to enter into the next life? Every pharaoh who died had to have the correct ritual knowledge to pass the gates in the next life. And they took on the Menes crown to prove that they had been properly ritualized. And that is the crown that the great Sphinx wears. It has that nape of the neck headdress with the stripes, right? It mimics the lion's mane. And it turns out that if you were correctly ritually initiated into the afterlife, you often were dressed in a lion's robe, right? And so thus the presence of the Sphinx at the tombs. And so the idea then being, by the way, when Gilgamesh goes to the underworld, he has to wear a lion robe. And when Heracles' first labor is to kill a lion and wear its robe. In fact, there are a dozen classical Greek writers in the ancient world who all testify that the myth of Heracles comes from Egypt, that all the labors of Heracles are Egyptian in origin, and they're probably right. So a lot of the Egyptian myth is actually being siphoned up through Egypt. What was that?
No, that's good.
Is that good? Okay.
Yeah, that's good. I want to read a couple of the negative confessions that I think are interesting and telling. I have not stopped the flow of water. I have not stolen bread. I have not stolen grain. Like, there's some very specific things that you can almost begin to see why, in that culture, those would be sinful. I think we're at time, unless there's any last comments, to take questions for the last 15 minutes. So do you have any questions for the panelists? Right here.
With like ancient religions and even maybe religions today, like, I don't want to, anyway, when does inspiration become cultural appropriation, if you guys have any thoughts on that?
My religious viewpoint, or my religion's viewpoint, since it is an ancient religion as well, is there isn't such a thing. We hope that anyone who encounters this stuff has fun with it, learns from it, and investigates as much as they want to. But as long as it's done in a decent spirit of not for negative purposes, feel free.
I'm the wrong guy to ask that question to, because I'm not a believer in cultural appropriation. As long as you're respectful, then I mean, that's the line that you should.
The reality is that doing it at all, there will be some who will cry cultural appropriation. So be cognizant that someone with an extreme view of that phenomenon may react to you using it at all. But I was brought up under the tradition with fiction, coming to things like this with some of the great writers of speculative fiction. Your job is to tell great stories. So as long as you're not tearing things down and you're actively trying to entertain and thrill and edify, I think that everything is game, right? I really hope, because the extreme of that is no one gets to write about anything except their own experience, which means I only get to write about middle-aged white metalheads. And those are some cool stories, but I've got way more stories I want to tell. So just be thoughtful, but don't constrain yourself. Your job as a fiction writer is to tell great stories.
If I wrote a story about middle-aged metalheads, I'd be culturally appropriate.
Okay, more questions.
I have kind of a fun one. What is, having looked into, because there's, like you said, thousands of different deities throughout Egyptian culture and history, what is one of your favorites?
All right. My favorite is Tuaret. She is... I'm glad we're on the same page. So Tuaret is the hippopotamus deity, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. I'd like to point out that in our modern sensibilities, we've kind of almost infantilized the hippopotamus, and we make like purple, happy ones that we give to our babies. There are more deaths in Africa from hippopotamuses than from lions. They're actually very fierce and very dangerous, and I like the idea of a hippopotamus lady eating the bad spirits that are going to try and harm a laboring mother.
Is it hippopotamuses? It's not hippopotami?
It's hippopotamopodes.
There's a Disney film that's got two hippopotamuses doing this dance in the mud. See, this is where we get the dumbing down of the hippopotamus. Okay, what more questions? Back.
You mentioned about the 72 judgments. Is there significance to the number 72? Because Muslim extremists use the idea that they're going to go to heaven and be greeted by 72 virgins. And that's not actually in the Quran, that was something that was developed later. So is there a connection between the use of that number between those two pretty much extreme?
Oh, so in the Quran, it's actually 70 and not 72. That's all I know about that subject.
Well, there are 70 disciples, sometimes translated as 72 in the New Testament. So this is a repeated number, and you know, some writers talk about it's astronomical in that 72 years is 1 degree of precession. You know, is that what it is? I don't know. The number 70, I believe, was the number of days it took the star Sirius to reappear on the horizon after it disappeared on the horizon, and therefore it is that's a symbol of rebirth. So it is astronomical, and it's based off a star in the sky, the brightest star other than our sun is Sirius. And when that rose heliacally, the Nile flooded. So it's a star associated with life and the floodwaters, and so when it disappeared in the underworld for 70 days, that's 70 or 72, depending on who's writing it. That's why that number keeps showing up in Egypt.
So with all of this, like variants and all sorts of things to look into, where would be a good place to start? Like where, if we want to learn more, where shall we go?
I really like this book. It's published by Barnes & Noble Books. It's called Ancient Egypt, an illustrated reference to the myths, religions, pyramids, and temples in the land of pharaohs. And it's by Lorna Oakes and Lucia Galen. I recommend this one because the books that I had when I was in college are out of print.
Wikipedia just informed me that apparently the 72 thing has something to do with Horus stealing a 72nd of every day to create the 5 intercalary days.
Oh, yeah.
And also apparently Osiris's coffin was guarded by 72 disciples of Saturn. So,
Yeah.
Google today.
We've got a few minutes left if there are more questions.
Mine's kind of mythological. I'm just curious, has Egypt always been, and your comment was like an edge culture? Has that consistently been the case? Are they like Fremen? What's the, like, has there been a time when that was not the case?
So I'm going to first widen out to a wider perspective. We do know that the Sahara is much larger today than it used to be.
Okay.
But as far as I know, based on mythology, Egypt has always been pretty constrained by the Nile. We do know of other societies where the birth of deserts was definitely witnessed. I think some ancient Chinese civilizations, ancient Indian and ancient Native American, where they actually talk about a time of plenty and then the emergence of this, which you can then go very ecologically verify. But I'm not aware of a sort of time of plenty with Egypt.
So even today, if you were to look at a satellite photo of Egypt, you would see brown and this like green flower sort of shape where the Nile is. Now, since the building of the Osman Dam in the 80s, they've had a lot more prosperity because they're basically stealing water from the southern part of the Nile. But even today, there's desert and then there's the Nile. And if you were to look even at one of those maps that shows, like at night, where all of the population is, it would all be along the Nile, even now.
From 10,000 to 7,000 BCE, Egypt was a rain plain, so it was marshes. So a lot of the desert is more, I mean, within the last 7,000 to 8,000 years. So, you know, and that's a very long time. You know, my good friend Robert Schock, he's the geologist who teaches at Boston University, and he was the guy that dated the Sphinx enclosure at the Great Pyramid to the era of the rain plain because it has water erosion in it and not sand and dust erosion. And so his argument is at least the base of the Sphinx was first carved when Egypt was a rain plain, thousands of years before the pyramids. Well, you can guess what the Egyptologists did to that theory. But he's become quite famous, so, you know, it works out. But the geology is pretty simple. It is water erosion at the base enclosure. That doesn't mean the Sphinx was built then. It just means that some structure at the very beginning could have been built there. And of course we have Doggerland, which is all the land now covered by the Mediterranean and Bering Strait, where there are stone structures on the sea floor. So people have been living there for thousands of years, and you know, we just don't know anything about it.
One more? Okay, any final comments from our panelists?
Nick, weren't you going to do a rendition of King Tut, Steve Martin's King Tut? No?
No. I was going to say that the parallels between Set and Loki are pretty fun, and probably my favorite Set story is where he goes to kill the Serpent of Chaos, because if anyone's going to be a chaos monster, it's going to be him.
What I like about some of what you've heard here, which you maybe haven't heard, is those are hugely suggestive of stories you could write. This idea that the pyramids were so much older is not something most of your readers will ever encounter. So you presenting that in story fashion then sort of sets up an interesting conceit and story architecture for you. So probably without a great deal of energy, you can find some of these theories, because it seems to be something about which we don't know so much, becoming the fertile ground, which is where we started with this. It's a very fertile ground for stories. Do you have another question?
If we have time.
Sure, go ahead.
I have lots. I was curious, so through the lens of Hero with 1,000 Faces, the monument, how well does Egyptian mythology fit into that very constricting lens?
Well, next the Jungian. I just got my doctorate from the Joseph Campbell School of Comparative Myth, so I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
Go for it. You answer that question.
Well, I'm not nearly as versed with Egyptian myth as they are, but I think it actually fits quite well. You know, you can already see the themes, right? You got the jealous brother, right? That's seen in Abel and Set in thousands of Loki, go on and on and on. The idea of resurrection for the purpose of salvation is huge. The idea that the hero has to die and come back in order to save everyone. It's super important. But yeah, I definitely see parallels there, but I'm honestly not familiar enough with Egyptian myth to offer more.
The great weakness of the monolith theory is you can make any story fit it, right? So yes, Egyptian mythology follows the monomyth paradigm of Joseph Campbell, but then again, so does Star Wars and Bohemian Rhapsody.
I would say
You're going to have to explain that to me later. Kind of pulled that out of your ass. Go ahead. You're going to say
I
something.
would say also what brings mythology, the Egyptian mythology, into people's everyday life was, we mentioned how it was very ritualized in the temple, because the pharaoh would go through this temple ceremony during their lifetime, and they would become Osiris and become Horus. And initially that was limited to the pharaohs only. But then as time went on, then it was expanded to the queens, and then also to the priests and the priestesses. They would be able to identify with these gods. And I think that is something that's very human, where I would argue, Jungian, where regular people aspire and identify with that divinity.
Okay, let's hear it for our panelists.